March 15, 1943. Lieutenant Arthur Pemberton had served under Churchill for 18 months. He'd never questioned an order. That's why nobody expected him to stand up when his commander-in-chief called 4 million starving Bengalis a beastly people with a beastly religion. But someone else did. Lieutenant Ravi Sharma stepped forward, looked Churchill in the eye, and said the words that would haunt Arthur for 70 years. "History will remember this genocide, sir, and it will remember who stayed silent." Churchill's reply lasted 12 seconds. Those 12 words destroyed Sharma's life, altered the course of the Bengal famine, and created the lie Arthur Pemberton has been protecting ever since. The lie that made him Britain's most trusted historian. The lie that's about to destroy everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The weight of silence. The gramophone crackled to life in Arthur Pemberton's study, its brass horn catching the firelight like a golden throat about to scream. He shouldn't have kept the recording. 70 years of successful lies, and he'd preserved the one piece of evidence that could unravel them all. Churchill's voice filled the room, tinny but unmistakable. "Let me be quite clear, gentlemen. The Indians breed like rabbits and die like flies. It's their natural state." Arthur's hand trembled as he reached for the whiskey decanter. Even now, at 68, the Prime Minister's casual cruelty made his stomach lurch. But it was what came next that had kept him awake for 7 decades. "Sir, with respect, that's precisely the attitude killing 4 million people." Lieutenant Ravi Sharma's voice cut through the static, young and foolishly brave. "The grain ships you're diverting to Europe could save Bengal. This isn't military strategy, it's deliberate starvation." The silence that followed lasted exactly 4 seconds. Arthur knew because he'd counted them obsessively, wondering if those 4 seconds represented his last chance to speak up, to stand beside Sharma, to choose courage over career. He'd chosen silence. Churchill's response came like a blade through silk, "Lieutenant. Your concern for the enemy's welfare suggests a dangerous confusion about which side you're fighting for. The Bengali people aren't our enemies, sir. They're starving because they're an inferior race that's failed to feed itself adequately. Darwin in action. Lieutenant Sharma." Churchill's chuckle was audible through the decades, "though I suppose, given your heritage, you might see things differently." Arthur closed his eyes, remembering how every officer in that tent had suddenly found their boots fascinating, how the humid Bengal air had seemed to thicken with collective cowardice, how Ravi Sharma had stood absolutely alone, his dark eyes reflecting a kind of moral clarity that Arthur envied and despised in equal measure. "History will remember this genocide, sir, and it will remember who stayed silent." Those words. God, those words had branded themselves into Arthur's soul. Even now, they made his chest tighten with a familiar cocktail of shame and rage. Churchill's final response had been delivered with the casual precision of a man swatting a fly. "History, Lieutenant, is written by the victors. You won't be among them." 12 words. 12 words that had condemned Ravi Sharma to a colonial prison cell where he died of dysentery 6 weeks later. 12 words that had launched Arthur's career as Churchill's most faithful chronicler. The recording ended with a mechanical click. Arthur poured another whiskey, his third since sunset. Outside his London study, traffic hummed along streets lit by warm yellow lamps. Inside, the weight of 4 million ghosts pressed down like a physical thing. His phone buzzed. A text from his publisher, Arthur. "Brilliant work on the Churchill biography. The Telegraph wants an interview about your unique insights into wartime leadership. Can you do Thursday?" Unique insights. If only they knew. Arthur had spent 40 years crafting Churchill's legend, transforming a racist warmonger into democracy's champion. Every book, every lecture, every carefully worded documentary had been another brick in the wall protecting Churchill's reputation, and by extension, protecting Arthur from the truth of his own cowardice. The irony was exquisite. His guilt had made him the perfect guardian of Churchill's legacy. Who better to sanitize history than someone who understood exactly which parts needed bleaching? But keeping the recording had been his secret act of penance, a private acknowledgement of truth in a life built on public lies. He'd told himself it was insurance, or evidence, or simple masochism. Really, it was the only honest thing he'd done since 1943. The study door creaked. Mrs. Henderson, his housekeeper, peered in with practiced concern. "Colonel Pemberton, there's a young woman here to see you. Says it's about your research. I told her it was rather late, but she's quite insistent. Name? Maya Sharma. She says she's a journalist." The whiskey glass slipped from Arthur's fingers, shattering against the Persian rug. Sharma. After 70 years, that name still hit like shrapnel. "Sir, are you all right?" Arthur stared at the gramophone, its brass horn now seeming less like a throat than a grave marker. How many Sharmas had survived the famine? How many had lived to have children, grandchildren, journalists who might come knocking on old Colonel's doors asking uncomfortable questions? "Show her in," he said, his voice steadier than his hands. "And Mrs. Henderson? Perhaps some tea. This might take a while." As footsteps approached down the hallway, Arthur quickly switched off the gramophone and slid the recording into his desk drawer. But he could still hear Ravi Sharma's voice echoing in the sudden silence. History will remember who stayed silent. The footsteps stopped outside his door. Time, it seemed, had finally come to collect its debt. The weight of legacy. The knock came soft but insistent, 3 measured raps that seemed to echo through Arthur's chest cavity. He stood frozen behind his desk, one hand still gripping the drawer handle where the recording lay hidden, the other pressed flat against the mahogany surface for support. The broken whiskey glass glittered at his feet like scattered stars, amber liquid seeping into the Persian rug his late wife Eleanor had chosen during their honeymoon in Istanbul 43 years ago. Eleanor. Christ, what would she think if she were alive to see this moment? She who had believed so completely in the noble version of Arthur she'd married, the decorated colonel, the respected historian, the man who'd served his country with honor, the man who existed only in carefully edited memories and public accolades. "Sir?" Mrs. Henderson's voice carried a note of concern from the hallway. "Shall I bring the tea service?" Arthur cleared his throat, surprised by how normal his voice sounded. "Yes, Margaret. The good china, please." A ridiculous request for a journalist making evening calls, but ritual felt important now. Eleanor had always insisted that proper tea could civilize any conversation, no matter how brutal its content. The footsteps retreated toward the kitchen, leaving Arthur alone with his thundering pulse and the weight of 7 decades pressing down like a collapsed roof. He moved to the window, seeking air, seeking perspective, seeking anything but the reflection of his own pale face in the darkened glass. Beyond the Georgian townhouse's elegant facade, Belgravia hummed with its usual evening rhythm. Couples walked hand in hand beneath the gas lamps, their breath visible in small white puffs. A taxi idled outside the embassy across the square. Normal people living normal lives, unburdened by the kind of secrets that could reshape history. Arthur's study had always been his sanctuary. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined 3 walls, packed with first editions, military histories, and the 37 volumes he'd authored over 4 decades. His knighthood certificate hung beside photographs of him with prime ministers, generals, and royalty. A life's work dedicated to preserving Britain's finest hour, even as he'd systematically erased its darkest moments. The room smelled of aged leather, pipe tobacco, and the lingering ghost of Eleanor's gardenia perfume. Sometimes, late at night, he could swear she was still here, curled in the reading chair by the fire with her needlepoint and her gentle questions about his work. She'd never pushed when he deflected conversations about India, about the war, about the nightmares that still woke him screaming at 78 years old. Papa fought in Bengal too, she'd said once, early in their marriage. He never talked about it either. Said some things were better left buried. If only she'd known how deep Arthur's particular grave went. The mantelpiece held their wedding photograph, Eleanor radiant in ivory silk, Arthur young and foolishly optimistic in his dress uniform. Beside it, a more recent picture showed their daughter Sarah with his grandson Timothy at last year's Christmas dinner. Tim, bright-eyed and 16, had spent the afternoon peppering Arthur with questions about heroism, about standing up for what's right, about being the kind of man who makes history instead of simply recording it. "I want to be like you, Grandpapa," the boy had said, eyes shining with admiration. Someone who fights for justice. Arthur had excused himself to vomit in the guest bathroom. Sarah visited twice monthly, always bringing flowers, always asking if he was eating properly, sleeping well, keeping up with his social obligations. She worried about his isolation since Eleanor's death 3 years ago, his increasing reluctance to appear at public events or give interviews. She attributed it to grief, to age, to the natural withdrawal of a man watching his contemporaries die one by one. She had no idea her father's entire identity was built on a lie that could destroy not just his legacy, but her faith in everything she'd believed about the man who'd raised her. The front door's heavy oak panels muffled voices, Mrs. Henderson's brisk efficiency, a younger woman's responses in accented English. Indian, unmistakably, though softened by years in Britain. Arthur's chest tightened as memory superimposed Ravi Sharma's voice over the stranger's, the same cadences, the same careful precision with consonants. Footsteps approached again, 2 sets this time, measured and inevitable as a funeral march. Arthur returned to his desk chair, muscle memory arranging his face into the expression of dignified authority that had served him through countless interviews, lectures, and public appearances. The mask felt heavier tonight, more fragile, as if it might crack at the first serious blow. Mrs. Henderson appeared in the doorway, carrying a silver tea service that caught the firelight like captured moonbeams. Behind her stood a young woman in her late 20s, dark-eyed and fierce in the way Arthur remembered her grandfather being, with that same unsettling combination of intelligence and moral certainty that made comfortable lies impossible to maintain. "Colonel Pemberton," the woman said, stepping forward with extended hand. "I'm Maya Sharma. Thank you for seeing me at such an unusual hour." Her grip was firm, warm, alive in a way that made Arthur acutely aware of his own cold fingers, his paper-thin skin, the tremor he couldn't quite suppress. When she spoke his name, it sounded less like greeting than indictment. "Miss Sharma," he replied, gesturing toward the chair Eleanor had favored. "Please sit. I understand you're interested in my research." Maya settled into the chair with fluid grace, her gaze cataloging the room's contents with journalistic efficiency. When her eyes lingered on the gramophone, Arthur felt something vital shift inside his chest. "Actually, Colonel," she said, accepting a teacup from Mrs. Henderson with a polite nod, "I think my research might interest you more." Mrs. Henderson retreated with practiced discretion, pulling the heavy study door closed with barely a whisper. The latch clicking into place sounded unnaturally loud in the sudden silence, like a cell door sealing shut. Arthur lifted his teacup with deliberate care, buying time while his mind raced through possibilities. Maya Sharma sat poised in Eleanor's chair, her notebook balanced on her knee, pen held like a weapon. The firelight played across her features, and Arthur found himself searching for traces of the man who'd haunted his dreams for 7 decades. The resemblance was subtle but unmistakable. Something in the set of her jaw, the directness of her gaze, the way she held herself as if preparing for battle. Ravi Sharma had possessed that same quality, a kind of moral gravity that made other men feel small by comparison. "You're working on a story," Arthur said, settling back in his chair with forced casualness. "About Churchill, I presume? Most journalists who seek me out are interested in my perspectives on wartime leadership." Maya's smile held no warmth. "Not exactly. I'm investigating something more specific. The Bengal famine of 1943. Your name appears in several military records from that period." The teacup rattled against its saucer as Arthur set it down. "Ancient history, Miss Sharma. I was a very junior officer then, hardly in a position to witness anything of historical significance. Were you?" Maya opened her notebook, fingers dancing across pages filled with precise handwriting. According to War Office files, Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Pemberton was present at strategic planning meetings in Calcutta between September and November 1943. You were part of Churchill's advance staff during his India tour. Arthur's mouth went dry. Those files should have been sealed, buried in bureaucratic archives where ambitious journalists couldn't reach them. Administrative duties, mostly. Moving papers from one desk to another. Moving papers. Maya's pen scratched against paper as she wrote. Interesting phrase, because I've spent the last 6 months tracking down those papers. Supply manifests, shipping records, communications between London and the Bengal government. She pulled a manila folder from her bag, spreading documents across the small table between them. Even upside down, Arthur recognized the letterheads, the classification stamps, the bureaucratic language that had disguised genocide as policy. 4 million people starved to death, Maya continued, her voice steady, but Arthur caught the tremor beneath. While grain ships were diverted to build stockpiles in Europe, while Churchill cabled about Indians breeding like rabbits, while colonial officers were ordered to maintain the impression that everything was under control. Arthur forced himself to look at the documents, though each page felt like a physical blow. Miss Sharma, I understand you're trying to build a narrative, but wartime decisions were complex. Churchill was fighting a global war, making impossible choices. My grandfather was there. The words fell between them like stones into still water. Arthur's prepared deflections died in his throat. Maya reached into her bag again, this time producing a photograph. She placed it carefully beside the documents, a young Indian officer in British uniform, proud and serious, with eyes that Arthur remembered with crystal clarity. Lieutenant Ravi Sharma, Bengal Regiment. He wrote letters home describing what he saw, the warehouses full of grain while children starved outside, the meetings where British officers discussed population reduction as military strategy. Maya's voice grew softer, more dangerous. The meetings where one young officer tried to speak truth to power. Arthur's hands had gone numb. The photograph seemed to pulse with accusation, Ravi's eyes boring into him across 8 decades. Miss Sharma, I'm not sure what you're suggesting. I'm not suggesting anything, Colonel. I'm telling you what I know. Maya leaned forward, her intensity filling the space between them. My grandfather wrote about a meeting in November 1943, Churchill's final night in Bengal. A recording was made. The words hit Arthur like bullets. His vision grayed at the edges, and for a moment he thought he might faint. The recording. She knew about the recording. He wrote about the other officers in that tent. Maya continued relentlessly, how they sat in silence while Churchill dismissed 4 million deaths as natural selection. How they watched a young Indian lieutenant challenge the Prime Minister of England and did nothing when he was arrested 3 hours later. Arthur gripped the arms of his chair, fighting to maintain his composure. Recording equipment wasn't standard in field operations. You're describing something that couldn't have existed. Couldn't it? Maya's smile was sharp as a blade. Churchill was obsessed with historical documentation. He brought recording equipment everywhere, convinced his wartime speeches would define his legacy. She paused, letting the words sink in. What he didn't count on was preserving his most honest moments. The study felt suddenly airless. Arthur's carefully constructed world, 40 years of Churchill scholarship, a knighthood built on sanitized history, a reputation as Britain's foremost authority on wartime leadership, began to crack like ice under spring sun. What do you want? His voice came out as a whisper. Maya closed her notebook with surgical precision. Justice, Colonel. For my grandfather, for 4 million people whose deaths were written off as acceptable losses. She stood, gathering her documents, and the truth about why good men stayed silent when evil called itself necessity. Arthur sat frozen as Maya's footsteps faded down the hallway, the front door's solid thud echoing through the townhouse like a judge's gavel. The silence that followed felt different from his usual evening quiet, heavier, more accusatory, pregnant with the kind of dread that made his war injuries ache despite the warmth from the fireplace. The photograph of Ravi Sharma lay forgotten on the side table, face up, those familiar eyes seeming to track Arthur's movement as he stumbled to the drinks cabinet. His hands shook as he poured whiskey, amber liquid sloshing onto the mahogany surface. 3 fingers became 4, then 5. The burn down his throat did nothing to quiet the roaring in his ears. She doesn't know about the recording, he told himself. She's fishing, building a case on fragments and family stories. But even as he formed the thoughts, Arthur knew they were lies. Maya Sharma had her grandfather's eyes, the same unflinching directness that had seen through Churchill's rhetoric to the rot beneath. She wouldn't have come here without certainty. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed 11 times, each bronze note landing like a physical blow. Arthur found himself counting automatically, a nervous habit from childhood that surfaced during stress. Eleanor had noticed it during their courtship, had found it endearing. "You always count things when you're worried," she'd teased. "Church bells, raindrops, your own heartbeats." If only she could see him now, counting down to his own destruction. The telephone sat silent on his desk, black bakelite reflecting the firelight. Arthur stared at it for long minutes, his mind cycling through the implications of a single phone call. Sir Geoffrey Whitmore, his editor at Cambridge University Press, would need to know about potential complications with the Churchill biography scheduled for release next spring. Professor James Hartwell at the Imperial War Museum might have insights about how to contain journalistic inquiries. Lord Ashworth from the Churchill Society would certainly want advance warning if accusations were coming, but making those calls would mean admitting the threat was real. It would mean acknowledging that Maya Sharma possessed the power to reduce 40 years of careful reputation building to ash in memory. Arthur's reflection in the darkened window looked like a ghost, pale, insubstantial, already fading at the edges. Behind him, the study's familiar comfort had transformed into something more sinister. The books that had once represented intellectual achievement now felt like tombstones marking buried truths. The photographs with dignitaries seemed to mock him with their frozen smiles and empty handshakes. Mrs. Henderson appeared in the doorway carrying a tea tray, her efficient movements faltering when she saw Arthur's condition. "Sir, shall I clear away the service? Your guest left rather suddenly. Margaret." Arthur's voice sounded foreign to his own ears. "In your opinion, do I look like a man who could do terrible things?" His housekeeper paused, china cup suspended in her capable hands. She'd worked for the Pemberton household for 15 years, had watched Eleanor decline through cancer, had seen Arthur through the worst of his grief. Her discretion was legendary among Belgravia's domestic staff. "Colonel Pemberton," she said carefully, "I think most men are capable of terrible things under terrible circumstances. The measure isn't whether we stumble, it's whether we find the courage to stand back up." Her words hit harder than Maya's accusations had. Arthur turned back to the window, watching a young couple walk past beneath the street lamps, their laughter carrying on the autumn air, innocent, unburdened. Everything he'd lost 7 decades ago in a canvas tent outside Calcutta. "That journalist," he said without turning around. "If she returns, if she calls, you haven't seen me. I'm indisposed, traveling, dead, whatever seems most believable." "Sir?" "She's going to destroy me, Margaret. Everything I've built, everything people believe about Churchill, about the war, about—" Arthur's voice cracked. "About who I am." Mrs. Henderson set down the tea tray with deliberate care. "Perhaps," she said quietly, "some things need destroying before they can be built properly again." After she left, Arthur stood alone with his ghosts and his guilt and the terrible certainty that Maya Sharma wouldn't simply disappear back into whatever archive had spawned her research. She had the scent now, the predator's instinct for wounded prey. She would circle closer, asking harder questions, following paper trails that led inexorably back to November 1943 and a moment of cowardice that had defined everything since. The recording waited in his desk drawer like a loaded gun. For 40 years, Arthur had told himself it was evidence, insurance, a private penance for public sins. But holding on to it had been an act of vanity disguised as conscience, keeping proof of his proximity to power even as he documented power's crimes. Outside, London hummed with 8 million lives, 8 million stories, 8 million people who believed they understood their history because men like Arthur Pemberton had written it for them. Soon, very soon, one young journalist with her grandfather's moral certainty would tear down that comfortable fiction. And Arthur would have to decide whether to fight for his lies or finally tell the truth. Arthur remained at the window long after Mrs. Henderson's footsteps faded, his reflection becoming clearer as the street lamps dimmed and fewer passers-by disturbed the glass. The whiskey hadn't dulled the edges of his terror. If anything, it had sharpened them, making every memory more vivid, every consequence more inevitable. He moved to his desk with the careful steps of a man navigating a minefield. The mahogany surface bore the accumulated weight of 4 decades, fountain pens worn smooth by Eleanor's letters, reading glasses in their velvet case, the silver letter opener Sarah had given him for his 60th birthday. Normal things. A normal life built on abnormal foundations. The bottom drawer stuck, as it always did when London's autumn dampness settled into the wood. Arthur had to yank twice before it surrendered, revealing neat files of correspondence, tax documents, insurance papers, and beneath them all, wrapped in oiled cloth like a relic, the thing he'd carried for 78 years. The recording cylinder was smaller than he remembered, brass tarnished to green-black, its wax surface scarred by decades of careful handling. Edison Standard, the type Churchill's documentation team had used throughout the war. Arthur lifted it with the reverence reserved for dangerous artifacts, feeling its weight, barely 8 ounces of metal and wax that contained the power to reshape history. November 18, 1943. Strategic Planning Meeting. Bengal Division Headquarters. Present, Prime Minister Churchill, General Wavell, Colonel Morrison, Colonel Davies, Lieutenant Pemberton, Lieutenant Sharma. Arthur could recite the meeting's details with photographic precision, though he'd spent 78 years trying to forget them. Churchill had been in rare form that night, energized by brandy and the intoxicating proximity to absolute power. The famine reports lay scattered across the table like casualty lists, numbers that had lost all human meaning through bureaucratic translation. 4 million! Churchill's voice echoed from memory, that distinctive growl Arthur had once found inspiring. Natural selection, gentlemen. The weak perish, the strong survive. Darwin in action. General Wavell had shifted uncomfortably in his camp chair. Colonel Morrison had studied his brandy glass with sudden fascination. Colonel Davies had coughed into his handkerchief. And Lieutenant Arthur Pemberton had sat frozen, paralyzed by the collision between his hero worship and moral revulsion. Only Lieutenant Ravi Sharma had found his voice. Arthur's hands trembled as he rewrapped the cylinder, but the motion triggered another cascade of memory. Ravi rising from his chair, young and proud and doomed, his British uniform immaculate despite 3 days in the Bengali heat. With respect, Prime Minister, Ravi had said, his accent crisp with Oxford education and burning conviction. Those are not numbers, those are people, children, families who serve the Crown faithfully. Lieutenant, General Wavell had interrupted, warning thick in his voice. You forget yourself. But Ravi hadn't stopped, couldn't stop. The same moral gravity Maya had inherited had pulled him forward like a tide. I forget nothing, sir. I remember every village we've passed, every mother begging for rice while our warehouses overflow, every child who died while we discussed shipping schedules and strategic priorities. Ravi's voice had grown stronger with each word, filling the canvas tent with an authority that made Churchill's bluster seem suddenly petty. History will judge these decisions, gentlemen. History will ask why good men stayed silent when evil called itself necessity. The silence that followed had stretched like a bowstring. Arthur had felt every eye in the tent upon him, waiting to see if another junior officer would join this act of professional suicide. Here was his moment. The chance to stand beside a man of genuine courage, to speak truth to power, to be the hero he'd dreamed of becoming when he first donned his lieutenant's uniform. Instead, Arthur had studied his hands and said nothing. The arrest had come 3 hours later. Military police dragging Ravi from his quarters while Arthur watched from his own tent, paralyzed by the terrible mathematics of survival. Speaking up wouldn't save Ravi, it would only destroy them both. That's what Arthur had told himself then, what he'd told himself every day since. Now, cradling the recording that preserved every word of that night, Arthur understood the true cost of his silence. Not just Ravi's life, lost in some colonial prison whose records had conveniently vanished. Not just 4 million Bengali deaths that might have been prevented by louder voices, stronger protests. The cost was everything that came after. 40 years of sanitizing Churchill's legacy, building a career on comfortable lies, teaching students that heroism was simple and history was written by good men making hard choices. The grandfather clock chimed midnight, and Arthur realized with crystalline clarity that Maya Sharma wasn't just threatening to expose Churchill's crimes. She was threatening to expose Arthur's greatest failure, not what he'd done, but what he'd failed to do when courage was required and silence was complicity. Tomorrow she would return with harder questions. Tomorrow the walls would close tighter, and Arthur would have to decide whether protecting his reputation was worth the blood price he'd been paying for 78 years. Outside, London slept peacefully, trusting in the heroes their historians had given them. Arthur didn't sleep. He sat in his study chair as dawn crept through the curtains, the recording cylinder cradled in his lap like a confession waiting to be heard. His mind moved in restless circles, picking at the edges of Maya's visit, searching for escape routes that didn't exist. The telephone's shrill ring at 8:15 made him jump, nearly dropping the cylinder. Arthur stared at the black receiver for 3 more rings before answering, his voice hoarse from whiskey and sleeplessness. "Colonel Pemberton." Maya's voice cut through the line with surgical precision. "I hope you slept well, Miss Sharma." Arthur's throat felt lined with sand. "Rather early for journalists, isn't it?" "Early for some conversations, yes. But then some truths have waited long enough." A pause, filled with the static of transatlantic connection. "I'm calling from the British Library, their archives division. I've been here since 6, actually. Remarkable what one can access with the proper research credentials." Arthur's blood chilled. "I'm not sure what you expect to accomplish." Lieutenant Arthur James Pemberton, second son of Lord Pemberton of Devonshire, graduated Sandhurst, 1942. Posted to Bengal Division under General Wavell, 1943. Maya's voice carried the satisfaction of a prosecutor reading charges, mentioned in dispatches for administrative excellence. Rather vague commendation, wouldn't you say? Almost as if someone was trying very hard not to specify what exactly you'd done to earn recognition. The room spun slightly. Arthur gripped the phone tighter, his knuckles white against the black bakelite. "Service records are confidential." Funny thing about confidential records, Colonel. They have a way of becoming less confidential over time, especially when one knows precisely what to look for. Papers rustled on her end of the line. For instance, I found the arrest warrant for Lieutenant Ravi Sharma, dated November 18, 1943, signed by General Wavell himself. Arthur's vision grayed at the edges. That date, the meeting, the recording, Ravi's brave foolishness, burned in his memory like a brand. "The charges were fascinating," Maya continued relentlessly. "Sedition, conduct unbecoming an officer, incitement to rebellion, rather serious accusations for a lieutenant who'd previously earned nothing but commendations for his service record." Her voice grew softer, more dangerous. "The warrant lists witnesses to his alleged crimes. Would you care to guess who provided testimony?" Arthur couldn't breathe. The study walls seemed to contract, pressing against his chest like a vice. He knew what was coming, had known for 78 years this moment would arrive, but hearing it spoken aloud felt like watching his own execution. 3 officers testified to Lieutenant Sharma's seditious statements during an official meeting with Prime Minister Churchill: Colonel Morrison, Colonel Davies, Maya's pause stretched like eternity, and Lieutenant Arthur Pemberton. The words hit Arthur like physical blows. The telephone receiver slipped in his sweating palm as the terrible truth crashed over him. Not the comfortable lie he told himself for decades about watching silently while Ravi was arrested, but the unbearable reality that his own testimony had sealed Ravi's fate. No. The word escaped as a whisper. I wouldn't have." "Your signature is quite clear, Colonel, right there at the bottom of the statement." Lieutenant Sharma's remarks constituted a direct challenge to military authority and civilian leadership during wartime, rather eloquent for a man claiming ignorance now. Arthur's memory cracked open like a dam bursting, flooding him with images he'd successfully buried for 8 decades. Not silence during Ravi's arrest, participation. General Wavell's private summons the morning after the meeting, the careful explanation about duty, loyalty, the necessity of maintaining order during wartime, the gentle suggestion that Arthur's future in the service might depend on his willingness to provide accurate testimony about a dangerous subordinate's behavior. And Arthur had signed. God help him, he'd signed. "My grandfather died in colonial prison 18 months later," Maya continued, her voice steady, but Arthur could hear tears beneath the professional control. "Beaten to death by guards who'd been told he was a terrorist, a traitor, based on testimony from British officers he'd considered friends." Arthur dropped the phone, stumbling to his desk drawer where the recording cylinder waited. His hands shook as he unwrapped it, staring at the brass surface that contained not just Churchill's crimes but his own. He'd kept the recording not as evidence or insurance but as penance, proof that he'd witnessed evil and not only stayed silent, but actively participated in its cover-up. "Colonel?" Maya's voice came from the discarded receiver. "Colonel Pemberton?" Arthur picked up the phone with nerveless fingers. When he spoke, his voice sounded ancient, hollow as a tomb. "I remember everything now." The admission hung between them like a death sentence. Outside, London stirred to life. 8 million people beginning another day in a world built on comfortable lies. But in Arthur's study, surrounded by 40 years of careful reputation building, those lies finally crumbled into dust. He hadn't just failed to save Ravi Sharma, he'd helped destroy him. The silence stretched between them, measured in heartbeats and decades of buried guilt. Arthur could hear Maya breathing on the other end of the line, waiting for words that might never be adequate. "What do you want from me?" Arthur finally whispered, though he already knew the answer would destroy him. "The truth. All of it. The recording, the testimony, everything you've spent 40 years hiding behind your sanitized histories." Maya's voice carried the weight of inherited pain, generations of injustice seeking resolution. "But first, I want you to understand what your signature cost." Arthur sank deeper into his chair, the leather creaking like old bones. The recording cylinder sat on his desk now, no longer wrapped, its tarnished surface reflecting the morning light streaming through his windows. 40 years of careful curation. The books, the lectures, the comfortable mythology he'd built around Churchill's legacy, all of it balanced on the edge of obliteration. "After you testified against him," Maya continued, her voice steady but laced with controlled fury, "my grandfather spent 6 months in Presidency Jail in Calcutta. Do you know what happened to Indian officers accused of sedition, Colonel? What happened to educated men who dared challenge British authority?" Arthur closed his eyes, but the darkness behind his lids offered no escape from her words. "They made an example of him. Solitary confinement in a cell barely large enough to lie down. Interrogations that lasted days. Beatings that left him unable to walk properly." Maya's professional composure cracked slightly, revealing the raw grief beneath. The guards called him the traitor because that's what the arrest warrant labeled him. A traitor based on the sworn testimony of Lieutenant Arthur Pemberton. Each word was a nail in Arthur's coffin, sealing him inside the truth he'd spent 78 years avoiding. The comfortable narrative that he'd been a young man overwhelmed by circumstances, paralyzed by the impossibility of the situation, crumbled like ancient parchment. "He wrote letters," Maya said quietly, "to his wife, my grandmother. The prison allowed 1 letter per month, heavily censored. But between the lines, in words the censors didn't understand, he told her what was happening, how the British officers who'd shared meals with him, who'd called him friend, had turned against him when loyalty demanded courage." Arthur's throat constricted. He remembered Ravi's laughter during mess hall dinners, his stories about growing up in Calcutta, his dreams of an independent India built on the democratic principles he'd studied at Oxford. A good man, an honorable man. A man Arthur had betrayed with ink and paper and cowardice disguised as pragmatism. "Tell me about the meeting," Maya demanded, her voice cutting through his reverie like a blade. "Tell me about Churchill's words, about what my grandfather said that made you so afraid you'd sign away his life to protect your career." The room felt airless. Arthur loosened his tie with shaking fingers, staring at the recording cylinder that contained the evidence of that terrible night. For 4 decades, he'd convinced himself that keeping the recording was an act of conscience, a private penance for public compromise. Now he understood it was something far more pathetic, a souvenir of the moment he'd chosen survival over honor. "Your grandfather," Arthur began, his voice barely audible, "was the bravest man in that tent. Don't you dare—" "No, listen." Arthur's voice grew stronger, fueled by the terrible momentum of confession. "Churchill spoke about the famine like it was weather, natural forces beyond human control. He called 4 million deaths Darwin in action. And we all sat there, generals, colonels, educated men who should have known better, and we nodded along because contradicting Churchill meant ending our careers." Arthur stood, moving to the window that overlooked the quiet Belgravia street. Normal people live normal lives down there, unburdened by the weight of historical complicity. But Ravi couldn't stay silent. He stood up, looked Churchill in the eye, and called it what it was, evil disguised as policy. He said history would judge us for our silence. Arthur's reflection in the window looked like a ghost, pale and insubstantial. He was right, of course. History is judging us. You're judging us. And you signed the warrant anyway. 3 days later, when General Wavell called me to his office, when he explained about maintaining order and protecting British interests, Arthur's voice broke. I told myself I was being practical, realistic, that destroying my own career wouldn't save Ravi, wouldn't feed the starving millions. I convinced myself that surviving meant I could do good later, that staying silent was strategic rather than cowardly. But you knew better. Arthur pressed his forehead against the cool glass. I knew better. I kept the recording because part of me, the part that remembered why I became a soldier, why I believed in justice and honor, that part knew I'd committed an unforgivable sin. Not just against Ravi, but against everything I'd claimed to stand for. The admission hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Downstairs, Mrs. Henderson was preparing breakfast, moving through familiar routines in a house built on lies. Soon, very soon, those routines would end. Tomorrow, Maya said quietly, I'm publishing everything. The recording, the testimony, the real story behind Churchill's legacy. 40 years of sanitized history ends now. Arthur nodded to his reflection, finally understanding that some reckonings couldn't be avoided forever. Climax. Arthur remained at the window for a long moment after the line went dead, his forehead still pressed against the glass. The morning street below blurred as tears finally came, tears he'd held back for 78 years, salt water carrying decades of suppressed shame. When he finally turned from the window, the study looked different. The leather-bound volumes of his sanitized history seemed to mock him from their shelves. The framed photographs with prime ministers and generals appeared suddenly hollow, career achievements built on a foundation of blood and betrayal. Even his knighthood, that gleaming symbol of establishment approval, felt like a weight around his neck. The recording cylinder waited on his desk, patient as a judge. Arthur's hands trembled as he reached for his personal phone directory, flipping through pages until he found the number he needed. Maya Sharma had given him until tomorrow, but Arthur suddenly understood that tomorrow was a luxury he couldn't afford. Some confessions demanded immediate action. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. BBC News, Editorial Department. This is Colonel Arthur Pemberton. I need to speak with someone about a story of national importance. 20 minutes later, Arthur sat across from James Whitfield, the BBC's senior investigative producer, in the news building's austere conference room. Whitfield was younger than Arthur had expected, perhaps 40, with sharp eyes and prematurely gray hair that suggested too many late nights chasing difficult truths. Colonel Pemberton, Whitfield said carefully, when someone with your reputation calls requesting an emergency meeting about Churchill's legacy, it tends to get attention. What exactly are we discussing here? Arthur placed the recording cylinder on the polished table between them. We're discussing the difference between history and mythology, Mr. Whitfield, between comfortable lies and terrible truths. For the next hour, Arthur told the story he'd buried for 4 decades. Not the sanitized version he'd crafted for his books and lectures, but the raw, unvarnished truth of that night in Bengal. Churchill's callous dismissal of millions of deaths. Ravi Sharma's brave confrontation. Arthur's own cowardly testimony that had sealed an innocent man's fate. Whitfield listened without interruption, occasionally making notes but mostly studying Arthur's face with the intensity of a man accustomed to detecting deception. When Arthur finished, the silence stretched between them like a chasm. You understand what you're confessing to, Colonel? Whitfield asked quietly. This isn't just admitting to historical revisionism. You're confessing to complicity in a man's death, to decades of deliberate deception about one of Britain's most revered leaders. Arthur nodded slowly. I'm confessing to cowardice, to choosing personal survival over moral courage when it mattered most, and to spending 40 years protecting that choice by perpetuating lies about Churchill's record. Why now? After all these years, why come forward? Arthur thought of Maya's voice on the phone, steady and implacable as justice itself. Because someone else was willing to do what I should have done 78 years ago. Someone was willing to speak truth to power, regardless of the consequences. He gestured toward the cylinder. Because Ravi Sharma deserves better than dying in obscurity while his murderers are celebrated as heroes. Whitfield leaned forward, his journalist's instincts fully engaged. What about your reputation, your career, everything you've built? What about it? Arthur felt something loosening in his chest, a tension he'd carried so long he'd forgotten it was there. My reputation is built on lies. My career is founded on covering up genocide. Everything I've built is worthless if it required Ravi Sharma's death to maintain it. The establishment won't forgive this. Churchill's legacy is sacred ground in British politics. You'll be destroying more than your own career. You'll be challenging the entire mythology of British wartime heroism. Arthur stood, moving to the conference room's window that overlooked central London. Somewhere out there, Maya Sharma was preparing her own story, armed with documentary evidence and inherited fury. Tomorrow she would expose the truth with or without his cooperation. But Arthur finally understood that this wasn't about controlling the narrative or managing the damage. This was about choosing at last the right side of history. Then perhaps it's time that mythology was challenged, Arthur said quietly. Perhaps it's time Britain faced the true cost of its empire, instead of hiding behind comfortable stories about heroic leadership and necessary sacrifices. When he turned back to face Whitfield, Arthur's expression carried a resolution that had been absent for 78 years. I want to go on camera, tonight. I want to tell the complete truth about Churchill's role in the Bengal famine, about the good men who died trying to prevent it, and about the cowards like me who helped cover it up. Whitfield studied him for a long moment. You're certain? Once this airs, there's no going back. You'll be finished in academic circles, ostracized by the establishment, possibly prosecuted under the Official Secrets Act. Arthur smiled for the first time in days, feeling lighter than he had in decades. Mr. Whitfield, I've been finished for 78 years. I just didn't have the courage to admit it. The recording would air that evening, destroying everything Arthur had built, and finally, belatedly, serving justice for Ravi Sharma. The broadcast went live at 9 o'clock that evening. Arthur sat in the BBC studio's unforgiving lights, feeling smaller than he had in decades, yet somehow more substantial than he'd been in years. The makeup artist had tried to minimize the deep lines around his eyes, but nothing could hide the weight of 78 years pressing down on his shoulders. We're live in 10 seconds, the floor director announced. Arthur's hands rested steadily in his lap, steadier than they'd been all week. Across from him, James Whitfield shuffled his notes one final time, though Arthur suspected the veteran journalist had memorized every devastating question hours ago. 3, 2, 1. Good evening. I'm James Whitfield, and tonight we bring you an extraordinary confession that challenges everything we thought we knew about Winston Churchill's wartime leadership. With me is Colonel Arthur Pemberton, Britain's most respected Churchill historian, who has spent 40 years crafting the official narrative of our greatest leader. Tonight, he's here to destroy it. The red light on the camera felt like a laser, boring into Arthur's soul, but for the first time in decades, he welcomed the scrutiny. Colonel Pemberton, you've made some extraordinary claims about Churchill's role in the Bengal famine of 1943, claims that suggest deliberate genocide rather than wartime necessity. Arthur looked directly into the camera, imagining Maya Sharma watching from wherever she was, imagining the granddaughter of Ravi Sharma, finally hearing the truth her family had been denied for nearly 8 decades. Mr. Whitfield, I was present when Winston Churchill dismissed the deaths of 4 million Indians as Darwin in action. I heard him refuse aid shipments because he considered Bengali lives expendable, and I watched a brave officer, Lieutenant Ravi Sharma, challenge those decisions, only to be arrested for sedition 3 days later. And your role in Lieutenant Sharma's arrest? The moment stretched like eternity. Arthur could feel his reputation dying in real time, 40 years of careful construction crumbling with each word. But beneath the destruction, something else was being born, something that felt remarkably like peace. I signed the warrant. I provided testimony that condemned an innocent man to death in a colonial prison. I chose my career over justice, and I've spent 4 decades covering up that choice by perpetuating myths about Churchill's heroism. The studio fell silent except for the quiet hum of equipment. Even the camera operators had stopped moving. You understand the magnitude of what you're confessing to, Colonel? I understand that I've been complicit in genocide, Mr. Whitfield. That I helped murder a good man to protect my own prospects, then spent 40 years being celebrated for covering up the truth. I understand that some sins can't be absolved, only acknowledged. Arthur reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew the recording cylinder, placing it on the table between them with the reverence of a man handling sacred relics. This contains the complete recording of that meeting in 1943. Churchill's exact words, Lieutenant Sharma's brave response, and the silence of every other officer in that tent, including myself. I've kept it for 78 years, telling myself it was penance. Really, it was evidence of my own cowardice. The interview continued for another 20 minutes, each question stripping away another layer of the mythology Arthur had helped create. By the time the camera stopped rolling, nothing remained of Colonel Arthur Pemberton's public persona except honest rubble. Walking home through London's quiet streets afterward, Arthur felt oddly weightless. His phone had buzzed incessantly during the broadcast. Colleagues, publishers, university administrators, all scrambling to distance themselves from the suddenly toxic historian. He'd switched it off after the 7th call. The house in Belgravia felt different when he entered. Smaller somehow, as if his confession had shrunk the walls. Mrs. Henderson had left a tray of tea and biscuits in the study, along with a handwritten note. Watch the program, Colonel. About time someone told the truth. I'll have breakfast ready at the usual time. Arthur smiled, understanding that loyalty came in many forms, some worth having, others not. His answering machine blinked with dozens of messages, but only one mattered. Maya Sharma's voice, barely steady. Colonel Pemberton, my family, we never expected. Thank you. It doesn't absolve you, but it honors his memory. That's enough. Arthur played the message 3 times, then erased it along with all the others. The next morning brought headlines that would define the remainder of his life. Churchill historian confesses to genocide cover-up. Britain's wartime hero exposed as war criminal. The lies we tell ourselves about empire. Arthur read them over breakfast, feeling neither regret nor satisfaction, only the strange calm that comes after a fever finally breaks. His phone rang constantly. Reporters, historians, government officials demanding explanations or retractions or damage control. He answered none of them. Instead, Arthur spent the morning writing letters to Maya Sharma, to the families of famine victims whose stories he'd helped suppress, to the memory of Lieutenant Ravi Sharma, who died for speaking truth. Arthur had been too cowardly to defend. Some reckonings, he understood now, arrived exactly when they were meant to.